Okay, so Chris, I'm going to start with you. Every industry, every part of society is being impacted by technology. And as we talk about how virtual societies are going to be shaped, we want to think about what society actually looks like. There's the physical, and there's the virtual. And for quite some time, people thought they would be two distinct societies. But of course, as we're learning, they're actually one and complementing each other. What do you think of how society is evolving and emerging in this new era?
It's a great question. First of all, thank you for having me at this wonderful summit. Really appreciate it. I think you have to start with purpose, right? The purpose, I think, is to connect. And we found that over COVID. People wanted to connect, they couldn't connect. So they turned more towards virtual societies, right? They created virtual societies. That started with this, right? VR, but this is the ask for VR, by the way, right? So you have to be willing to put this on for hours a day. And there are reasons to do that, right? Virtual societies will bring together and connect people together and create amazing content. Mm-hmm. And that will then span into reality. The pure synthetic will span into and anchor into the reality, first, I think, in industrial and enterprise applications, mm-hmm. right? Where you can have that same sort of experience, but you can anchor to reality. And then eventually, it'll go to consumer, where you can have those same things in a much smaller, sexier form factor. You walk around, you can have a personal experience that only you see while you're anchored to the world, and you have your hands back so that you can interact, mm-hmm. right? It's a brand new way of interacting with your data on an immersive basis. And it really does span from completely kind of synthetic environments to anchoring to reality and really making people, augmenting people, making people better.
So that leap, let's say, from virtual reality, which still continues to exist, and having augmented reality, so the XR. Rashid, I want to turn to you, because then some people say, well, that really also translates into the metaverse. We've heard a lot about the metaverse. There's a lot of excitement. There were some questions asked when last year we saw also that there were some issues to do with parts of, at least, let's say, the metaverse, but also there are changes happening on the tech industry that a lot of people are interested in. So I wanted to ask you how that translates then into the metaverse, and is it, again, complementary or separate?
Yes, I think that's a really good question. So the way I like to think about it is there is virtual and there is augmented reality. And on the one hand, the move is towards how do we connect these online experiences, layer that into our physical reality. The other is how do we build worlds that are completely alien and different, or they could be like our world, but would be much more all-encompassing, and how do you immerse users into that? I think in both cases, there's a need, and some applications will favor one mode versus the other. Personally, I prefer augmented reality because I find full VR nauseating. The approach we take, though, is to be agnostic of, so us as a company, we're agnostic of how the metaverse is consumed. I think there's no correct answer. There's no single answer to say it has to be this way. But from our perspective, the important question is, how do we birth the metaverse? We've all seen movies like The Matrix or Ready Player One, and I think outside of the online games world, there's very little recognition that today having these consistent and persistent virtual or augmented realities is infeasible. It's such a massive computational challenge that we don't yet have the technologies. So I'm very interested in how do we actually approach that, and there is a little bit of a naivete among the those who are not connected deeply in the games, online games world, that the metaverse is just going to happen over the next couple of years, and there are very foundational problems that need to be solved, and many of them are research problems, not mere engineering or product development problems.
So I want to come back to the point of the structure, so to speak, to actually get it going. But before we do that, the issue of gaming, the latest statistic is 3.9 billion video gamers. Now, there's different levels of that. There are some that are very sophisticated, some are much more basic. But when we talk about societies, again, there are whole communities and societies. Somebody like me may not even understand if I haven't been in that world. So how does that also affect what we're saying about societies being developed in a world that's completely virtual?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. There's a question of who is a gamer today. Right. One of the interesting statistics that's come up time and time again with my time working with games studios and companies in that industry is that today your average gamer is a 45-year-old woman, right? Which is surprising. It's not a 17-year-old boy, for example. So there's a question of how are they consuming this virtual interactive experience and what is the appeal, A big component of this is social, connecting with people, competing with people, cooperating with people online, in a gamified sense, tends to have a hold. So in terms of, with gaming, in terms of what we deliver and what these experiences are like, there is quite a broad spectrum that leads us into the metaverse. And the technology pathway to it, the innovations that are going to lead us there, ultimately do center around community and how do we empower immersion, the network effect, the connectivity. I think that's only being tapped today quite lightly. I think there's much work to be done to see how these kinds of networks are going to coalesce and form. So it is a quite an interesting open problem, but we're sort of at the beginning of that journey.
And there are so many strands to this where it's still the beginning, and we don't know how it will pan out, but day to day, it's taking shape. So, Erich, I want to bring you in here because, of course, TikTok is one of those platforms that has so many different communities. And for us, for example, at the National, we've been kind of surprised in the last 2 to 3 years how you have a whole community out there that wants to have its news through TikTok, of course, in a very specific style. So, last I looked, it was 1 billion monthly active users. So again, it's incredible to have that sort of usage there. But how are societies formed? How is TikTok able to curate these sorts of different communities?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks a lot, Mina, for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And yeah, TikTok has really experienced phenomenal growth in the last few years. Clearly, it's something that's of great interest. I think it's interesting in this topic to just step back for a second and think about community for a minute. I think that historically, community has been defined by geography. Where do you live, and then the people around you, and what do you believe, and where do you buy your groceries and things like that. And I think that there's a temptation to sort of have this discussion be framed around like this major change. There's communities defined around geography, and then the next day we're putting on headsets. But in reality, it's been really a series of changes over time, and there's been incremental changes in the way we think about community. And I think TikTok is one of these steps. And I think what we find with it is that people are interested in being part of a broader community beyond their own geography. Right. And I think one of the interesting things about TikTok is that people find community, I think, in the mission statement, so to speak, of the platform, where they are interested in seeing creative entertainment, and some things are just universal. It's the biggest creator on the entire TikTok platform is a African immigrant who lives in Italy. That is our #1 creator, if you didn't know that. But the reason why is because he has a sort of universal appeal, I would say. But the interesting thing is, how do you bring sort of the physical, the local, into that broader community, and how do you make those two things work together? Which is obviously a challenge for having a community that is both global, so that people can find what they're interested in, but is local enough so that it's relevant to me, but that also it provides a platform for local governance as well. And I think that TikTok provides some clues about how to think about virtual communities as well. That virtual communities need governance. Virtual communities are going to appeal to different people. We talked about it in our prep session as being sort of a horizontal feature. It's not something that is going to be confined to gaming, but it'll be something that'll be broad-based. And then people will find ways to create or cultivate communities with the new technology, but probably based upon a lot of the principles that exist today around communities that exist on a platform like TikTok.
Chris, I mean, when we talk about these different communities, the issue of regulation comes in, but also to your point that if we have augmented reality, how do we ensure that there's access, especially in the immediate and midterm period coming up, that there's access that's more broad, that it doesn't get confined to only those who can afford the technology or those who are in schooling or in industries that can actually have access to it?
Sure. Just one other thing on top of what you said. I totally agree with what you said. Community purpose, right? People are not as worried about geography communities anymore. It's community of purpose, right? No matter what market vertical you're looking at or gaming or whatever. So to answer that question, I would look to the past, right? It always starts with the premium experience, the premium product, or a subsidized product, right? If you look at the premium features in a car, they start in a Mercedes-Benz, and then they filter down to your favorite car, right? I think the same thing is true here, unless governments step in and subsidize, right? The first area for at least augmented reality will be, in a broad-based way, will be industrial enterprise. Because the return on investment is very fast. If you're on an oil and gas rig and you have a problem that you can't fix, you can stick something like this on. A remote expert 1,000 miles away can come through a central camera, see what you see, and instruct you how to fix it, and draw on your mind's eye, because they've got lenses where you can see augment the world, on how to fix it, right? It costs what, $50,000 to send an expert to an oil rig? That's a lot of these.
And time, in addition to cost.
And opportunity cost.
Right.
So that's why this will hit every market vertical in enterprise and industrial first. And it will start to filter down. In addition to that, what's happening on the tech side, on the consumer side, and we work with a lot of the big tech guys for the lenses itself, the same sort of technology that goes into our glasses. Every single big tech guy, from Apple to Meta, to you guys, to Google, Samsung, every single one is defining their place in not only virtual reality, but in augmented reality. And they'll start with simple versions of that people can afford. Things that will allow simple augmentation. I call it data snacking, right? You have a map. You can have your schedule on a building as you walk by, things like that. And then it will go to more complex things. That is an opportunity, actually, because these big tech companies are so strong financially. They can subsidize those products because they'll make money on the software. Just like Sony subsidizes the PS5 because it makes so much money on the software. So first and foremost, industrial enterprise doesn't really need to be subsidized because businesses will pay. The ROI is there. On the consumer side, that will come probably faster than most people think because all of the big tech guys are in and they can subsidize themselves.
When you first said subsidize, I was thinking, my goodness, government subsidies? But no, I like this idea of big tech subsidizing because it makes financial sense.
I don't think governments will have to subsidize.
Yeah.
They just need to set a direction.
But I do have a question. So do you believe that there's always a spectrum between, so if I were to use a counterexample, the way supercomputers were built in the 70s up to 90s is there's a break between that and how supercomputers have been built since the 2000s. Because GPUs in the consumer world ended up becoming so powerful that they went back into industry.
Right.
And the traditional approach, the craze and so on that we used to XMPY and PSV3, those died out. So do you think that it's universally the case that you go through the spectrum of we build for industry and that's eventually going to trickle down to, and how would you make sure that these technologies, I guess in headsets, make their way?
I do think there'll be some convergence of that.
Right.
Because there needs to be more sensors to augment workers. Because it's about productivity. And every single country in the world should be interested, and I think is interested, in making their people more productive, right? So that's what these classes are really for. It's really about augmenting the person, making them better than they are, right? So there'll be that going on, and that will filter down for sure. But the big tech companies of the world, all over the world, will come out with their own versions, and they will come from below and come towards the middle.
But if you
That's
have...
my
Competition is going to cause the convergence.
Oh, for sure. I mean, just for instance, you have a company, Facebook, that changed its name to Meta, pushed all its chips to the center of the table, and said, we're going to be one of the standards here, right? Why did they do that? They have to do that. They have to have a standard. That's what they learned in smartphones. They didn't have a standard, and they lost about 60% of their market cap when Apple changed its rules on privacy. So they have to have a standard.
But I mean, that's also interesting what we've seen with OpenAI and ChatGPT taking the world by storm in December, and then suddenly everyone's like, hang on, we're also working on this, and then kind of accelerated, we saw with Google Bard and others. So to your point of who's the first mover, which is always important, but also who's setting the standards. But that then raises the issue of interoperability. Because there's concerns that actually you get locked out. So Rashid, what are your thoughts on interoperability, especially when it comes to metaverse?
Just really quickly, I would, again, counter-argue that what we have today are two monopolies, essentially, rather than a standard. But yeah, okay, I get the point.
Right,
makes sense.
fair.
So interoperability is, again, an interesting one, and I think this is, to an extent, misunderstood. If we kind of go at the philosophic view of what the metaverse looks like in the arts, movies like Ready Player One, or Matrix, even though that's very dystopian, there are obvious things within these virtual simulations that just won't happen in reality. For example, for that last battle scene, for those of you who've seen Ready Player One, to happen, where there are tanks attacking fortresses, there needs to be some sort of base reality that's agreed on, a base cosmology for the universe. And I think this is what's missed when people talk about interoperability. So I see two forms of interoperability discussed. One is pure blockchain. So if I've got my NFTs on Ethereum, how do I bridge them to Solana, for example? And I think that doesn't even matter at the end of the day. Then the second interoperability...
Why doesn't it matter before you get to the second?
Because I think that because the aim of blockchains is decentralization, and let's say one of them was technically capable of covering everything, and that wins out, that's completely fine, and we don't have a need for any of the others. So there's not a need to bridge. In the short term, yes, perhaps bridges help and so on. But the real interoperability, the problem here is if we are talking about transcending physical reality and moving to the digital realm, I think that's an important move, by the way. I think that has existential implications because of how the human psyche works. We are consumerist fundamentally. It's not just us, it's all of animals. We just have the capacity to exploit the natural world. The only long-term potential for sustainability is if we are able to shift our material needs into energy needs, which can be done with the shift to the metaverse. But if that's going to happen, then we need different individual creators and all these digital assets to be interoperable across different virtual worlds, microverses, let's say, within the metaverse. That is a hard problem. It's not as simple as defining the standards for 3D models, because the interpretation of that 3D model is down to a particular virtual world. And a particular virtual world is a binary that's executing on a machine. And the programmer who wrote the code determines how that object interacts. And the code has to pre-understand how to use this asset. You can't simply have an open economy of creators creating digital things being taken into arbitrarily many virtual worlds without manual work to implement the objects for every individual world and manual work for every individual virtual world or microverse to support every asset. There's an n square, there's a quadratic scaling problem that's just intractable. You can't overcome that. So fundamentally, we have to rethink how we agree on base reality, the physics of the metaverse, and how assets can interoperate without any foreknowledge of the asset. That doesn't exist today. I think that's an important problem. It's not going to be solved by just defining standards, which is the current approach.
Now, you've raised a number of issues, including the issue of scale, the physical space, and also who's determining a lot of this. But I want to take a step back, because I think for regular users who are thinking both about virtual societies, virtual worlds, and with time, the metaverse, there's a question of safety. So there's the question of safety of the users, and I think this comes up a lot, and it goes back to the point of regulation. A lot of it is self-regulation of the actual platforms, but also government often is moving a bit too late or not understanding how to regulate it. So Erich, I want to bring you in, of course, as General Counsel. I'm sure these are things that you think about just in terms of safety, but also regulation to ensure safety.
Yeah, I mean, safety is incredibly important, today, in a community like TikTok, and it's going to be, important in the communities we're talking about as well. Regulation is also an important part of safety. There's no question that, a core function of government is to look after the health, welfare, of its citizens, and part of that is being involved in, digital services as well. And I think that all responsible companies have to accept that and to actively, engage in understanding their responsibilities, what the laws require. Again, I would say that that we're learning a lot, in the current state of play. There are best practices that exist in the industry around the way a company like ours executes on safety, and it's really important, though, I think that a company like ours, peer companies, put the right level of investment against safety. I mean, I think that's really a key piece. I think it's gonna be very hard to find a company that wouldn't say that they care about safety and they want to make sure they're doing a good job. I think that's the investment sometimes that might differentiate them. And because safety is, safety is a cost center for a company. So it's really important that the company have a deep, commitment to safety, and then put wood behind it by making the investment. At our company, we have, investment not only in the human bodies to do the moderation and to make decisions about what content should be removed from the platform to make sure that we're safe from that perspective, but we have a very intensive investment in technology as well, which helps us both, decide before upload what content is safe, but also to create essentially the moderation cues for our human moderators to understand what is safe and what isn't. And I think as we look towards, the evolution of these communities into this virtual world, these are the same kinds of practices that you're going to want to see in that world as well. One of the challenges with it is how dynamic it is. You're going from, in the case of TikTok, it's the short form video is the common form of content right now, but we're actively integrating live experiences into our platform, which I think is probably a better analogy for what's going on in the virtual world, where you have people who are interacting with each other, as a general matter, and you need to have safety tools and moderators involved in that experience to be able to keep it safe. And I think in that context, one of the things that we're going to need to work out over time is to figure out how do you put parameters around the experience itself to make sure that you don't have the ability to create unsafe experiences, particularly for young users. where I think a lot of the focus has been historically in the safety dialogue, which is how do you make sure that young users who are in a virtual experience are not, encountering the wrong people or not engaged in the wrong kinds of conversations, things like that. And so I think that that's something that we're going to need to work out over time. Companies like ours that have investments in those areas are actively doing that.
But Erich, I just wanted to pick up on something you said. You mentioned that it's the role of the moderators. There's the human element, but there's also a lot of it that's machine-driven and machine learning. And so to what extent do you still think we're at the stage where you need that human element? And will that always continue? Or will we more and more rely on the machine learning mechanisms to step in?
I mean, my view is I don't see a time when you're not going to have people there. The machine learning technology that we would use in order to aid us in doing the moderation is getting better and more sophisticated over time. There's no question about that. It helps us address a very large percentage of the potentially harmful content. The issue is that there's a lot of gray areas in content. When you have policies, it's not black and white, and also the threat vectors are changing all the time. So changes in language or changes in experiences, they're changing all the time. And so you need human beings to process that X percentage of the experience that can't really be effectively moderated just by machines.
Chris, I want to turn to something you mentioned earlier about sensors and the importance. For a lot of what we're talking about, you'll need sensors. I mean, here in the UAE, we often talk about also, driverless cars, talking about other technologies, and that require sensors. But also there, you need governments want to step in, but to the point of interoperability and scale, because frankly, you're not going to set it up if it's just, 500 users, so to speak. So how do you bring all of that together, and at what point do you get to that threshold where, okay, this is now a technology that's adopted on a mass scale?
Well, so scale, I'll start with that, right?
Yeah.
I think it's hard to imagine the scale of this. It's going to affect every market vertical, right? Every industrial market vertical, every enterprise market vertical, every consumer market vertical. As much as this did, right? So, I mean, the scale is crazy, right? The growth trajectory over that is crazy. And then the convergence with, if I understood the question, with governments and things like that. And just, if I could take it in one direction, privacy.
Right.
Right? I believe, and this is my belief, I don't believe there is privacy anymore.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I don't believe there's privacy anymore.
I thought you said that, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I think we have given up privacy for convenience.
Right.
And we've done it kind of knowingly, right?
Yes, we all take the terms and conditions.
The question isn't privacy, it's ownership over your likeness and ownership over your information. And that's going to become way more important to people, because when AI or some of these other tools can take you and put you somewhere where you're not, that's kind of a problem, right? So ownership of that is very, very important. Ownership of it and how governments can use that, and ownership of it and how nefarious people can use it and companies can use it, right?
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, because I would have loved to continue that conversation, especially on your point about privacy and that we willingly give up our data and what that means. With that, thank you very much for putting a spotlight on all these complex issues, but also that touch all parts of our lives. Please thank our panel and get ready to welcome our next panel.